The greatest weapon of ancient empires wasn't its army. It was something far less glamorous, a network of hidden systems that made centuries of stability possible across territories larger than anything we can imagine today. By the end of this video, you will see how these overlooked bureaucracies were the true engines of control, allowing empires like Han China, Maurya India, and the Inca to thrive long after their conquerors and kings passed into memory. How did these early states manage millions of people with no phones, no computers, and only the slowest communication? And why do these quiet administrative structures remain so invisible in the stories we tell about history? What comes to mind when you think of what really held an empire together? For centuries, the story of empire has been told through the roar of battle and the crown of kings. The names that echo down to us are conquerors, pharaohs, emperors, but the real engine of stability was never the throne. It was the quiet machinery humming beneath it. Traditional chroniclers, often employed by the very rulers they celebrated, had little reason to dwell on the mundane work of tax collectors, scribes, and surveyors. They wrote tales of glory, of divine right, of singular genius. Yet recent scholarship paints a very different picture. It reveals that the most successful early empires were not simple autocracies where a single will twisted the fate of millions. They were sophisticated administrative networks, deliberately designed to function regardless of who sat on the seat of power. Take the Han Dynasty of China. The emperor was the public face, but the civil service examination system, the meticulous census records, and the standardized weights and measures were the hidden threads that held the vast territory together. In Maurya India, the Arthashastra, a manual on statecraft, outlines an elaborate bureaucracy of spies, accountants, and regional governors that operated independently of the king's personal whims. These systems were not merely decorative, they were built to outlast any single ruler. The genius of these bureaucracies was their invisibility. They worked so seamlessly that even the people living within them often failed to notice their existence. Only when something went wrong did anyone think to look. Floods, famines, rebellions revealed the cracks, but for decades, sometimes centuries, the quiet labor of countless officials made empire feel as natural as the seasons. The chroniclers left them out on purpose, not because they were unimportant, but because their true power lay in being unseen. And that hidden architecture, more than any single conqueror, is what allowed these early states to pass stability from one generation to the next without collapsing into chaos. The first of those unseen tools was writing itself. Before the invention of written records, every agreement, every tax payment, every legal judgment depended entirely on human memory. A chief could remember the number of sheep owed by each family, but only for so long. Once that chief passed away or simply forgot, the entire system of obligation and trust had to be rebuilt from scratch. Oral tradition worked well for small communities, but it could never scale. The moment an empire stretched beyond a day's walk, memory became a liability. That is why the very first bureaucracies emerged not from a desire for poetry or storytelling, but from the cold need to count and track things. The earliest known writing, cuneiform in Mesopotamia, was not invented to record myths or royal decrees. It was designed for accounting. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of clay tablets from the ancient city of Uruk, and the vast majority are not grand narratives. They are receipts, lists of barley, records of livestock, tallies of workers and their daily rations. Scribes pressed wedge-shaped symbols into wet clay to capture who gave what and who received what. These tablets were the first permanent ledgers. They allowed a ruler in Uruk to know exactly how much grain was stored in a warehouse miles away without ever leaving the palace. For the first time, governance could operate across distance and time. In Egypt, hieroglyphs served a similar purpose but with an added layer of sacred authority. The pharaohs used writing not only to track the annual flood of the Nile and the resulting taxes, but also to codify law and royal decrees that were meant to last forever. Carved into stone, these inscriptions were not just records, they were statements of permanence. When a scribe recorded a decree, that decree became part of the order of the world. Disobeying it was not just a crime, it was a disruption of cosmic balance. That blend of administrative power and religious meaning made Egyptian bureaucracy especially durable. Meanwhile, in Shang, China, the earliest surviving Chinese writing appears on oracle bones, which were used for divination. But even these spiritual texts reveal a bureaucratic mind at work. The kings asked questions about harvests, military campaigns, and the health of the court. The answers were carved into bone and turtle shell, then stored. These records became a repository of precedent. Future rulers could consult them to see what had worked before. Over time, this practice evolved into a full system of written annals and administrative registers. The Shang dynasty's ability to mobilize thousands of workers for bronze casting and tomb construction depended entirely on these written records. Across all these early civilizations, writing performed the same essential function. It allowed information to exist independently of any individual. A tax official could die, but the tax roll remained. A governor could be corrupt, but the royal inspector could compare his reports against the original census. Written records made oversight possible. They turned governance into something that could be checked, verified, and passed down. Without cuneiform, hieroglyphs, and oracle bone inscriptions, the great empires of the ancient world would have been nothing more than temporary conquests. They would have collapsed the moment the conqueror fell silent. But writing gave them a voice that could speak across generations, and that voice was the true foundation of their stability. But the Han dynasty transformed writing into something far more powerful than simple record-keeping. They turned it into a tool that actively shaped who would govern. In earlier empires, administrative roles were often handed down through family or awarded as favors to loyal allies. This created a constant problem. Officials were loyal to their patrons, not to the empire. They built personal power bases and siphoned wealth away from the central government. The Han emperors understood that if they wanted real stability, they needed a new kind of official, one whose first loyalty was to the state itself. Their solution was revolutionary. They created a system of civil service examinations based on Confucian texts. These exams were open, at least in principle, to any man who could study the classics. Wealthy families certainly had an advantage because they could afford tutors and years of preparation. But the key point is that birth alone no longer guaranteed a position. A poor but brilliant scholar could theoretically rise to the highest levels of government. That was a radical idea in a world where family lineage normally decided everything. The exams were grueling. Candidates spent years memorizing the 5 classics, commentaries, and historical precedents. They had to write essays on statecraft, compose poetry, and demonstrate a deep understanding of Confucian ethics. The testing sessions took place in tiny, isolated cubicles where candidates would sit for days, writing by candlelight. Failure was common, and many men spent their entire lives trying to pass. But those who succeeded entered a world of immense prestige and power. They became scholar officials, the backbone of the Han bureaucracy. Once appointed, these officials were not left to their own devices. The Han government employed a network of censors, imperial inspectors whose job was to watch the watchers. These censors traveled through the provinces, auditing accounts, reviewing legal judgments, and listening to complaints from common people. If a governor was found to be corrupt or incompetent, the censor reported directly to the emperor. This created a system of checks and balances that was remarkably effective for its time. Governors knew they were being monitored. They could not build independent power bases without risk. The census system ensured that even the farthest reaches of the empire remained connected to the central government. Over time, this bureaucratic class developed its own culture and identity. Scholar officials were trained in the same texts, shared the same values, and communicated in a standardized written language. That uniformity was crucial. An official from the capital could be sent to a distant province and immediately understand the local administration because it operated by the same rules. When the Han dynasty eventually fell, the bureaucracy did not disappear. It outlasted the emperors. Later dynasties, including the Tang and Song, revived and refined the examination system, building directly on the foundation the Han had laid. The scholar official class became a permanent feature of Chinese governance, surviving invasions, rebellions, and changes of dynasty. The Han civil service was not just a way to run an empire. It was an engine of continuity that kept the idea of a unified China alive for over 2,000 years, and it raises a fascinating question. What if the real legacy of the Han dynasty was not its territorial conquests, but the invisible architecture of intellectual and administrative control that it passed down to every ruler who followed? While the Han dynasty perfected the scholar official, another empire in India built a bureaucracy that ran on secrets and surveillance. The Mauryan Empire, founded by Chandragupta around 320 BC, faced a challenge even greater than China's. India was a patchwork of languages, religions, and local kingdoms, a vast and dizzying subcontinent that had never been unified before. How do you hold that together with a single fist? The answer came from a man named Kautilya, also known as Chanakya, a strategist and philosopher who wrote the Arthashastra, a manual on statecraft that is as cold and precise as a blade. Kautilya understood that loyalty is fragile and that information is the only real currency of power, so he designed a government that was always watching. The Mauryan bureaucracy included a vast network of spies, not just in foreign courts but inside the empire itself. These spies were not shadowy assassins. They were informants disguised as merchants, monks, or wandering ascetics. They reported directly to the chief minister on the mood of the provinces, the honesty of local officials, and the whispers of rebellion. Every governor knew that a seemingly harmless traveler might be a royal agent. That uncertainty kept them honest. The empire itself was divided into 4 provinces, each governed by a prince or a trusted appointee. But their power was carefully limited by a central administration that controlled taxes, trade, and justice through a written code. The Arthashastra lays out incredibly detailed regulations for everything. How much tax a farmer should pay on his harvest, how a merchant must weigh his goods, how a judge should interrogate a witness. Nothing was left to chance. Even the king was not above the system. Kautilya wrote that the king's duty was to protect the people and enforce the law, and that a king who failed could be replaced. This was not a revolution in democracy. It was a revolution in efficiency. By standardizing procedures across the subcontinent, the Mauryans created a predictable environment where a farmer in the Ganges Valley and a trader on the Indus coast operated under the same rules. That consistency made the empire feel stable and fair, even when the ruler was absent. And because the intelligence network was separate from the regular administration, the central government always knew where the cracks were forming before they broke open. The Mauryan bureaucracy did not rely on charisma or conquest. It relied on information loops, on the steady flow of reports, audits, and regulations that kept the empire humming. When Chandragupta's grandson Ashoka later converted to Buddhism and turned away from war, the bureaucracy did not collapse. It simply shifted its focus. The same machinery that once collected taxes now spread edicts of peace across the stones of the empire. That is the quiet power Kautilya unleashed, a system that could serve any master, as long as the master understood that the real throne was not the one in the palace, but the one in the archive. Across the Iranian plateau, a different kind of administrative genius was taking shape. Under the Achaemenid Persian dynasty, and especially during the reign of Darius I, the empire stretched from the Indus River to the Balkans, from the Nile to Central Asia. It was the largest political entity the world had yet seen, and holding it together required a system so elegant that later empires would copy it for centuries. Darius divided the empire into roughly 20 provinces, each called a satrapy. At the head of each satrapy stood a governor known as a satrap, who was appointed directly by the king. But the satrap was not given absolute power. Instead, Darius carefully split authority within each province. A military commander answered to a separate chain of command, and a royal secretary monitored all financial records. This separation of powers meant that no single official could amass enough strength to challenge the throne. The system was designed to prevent rebellion before it could begin. But governing across such enormous distances required more than clever divisions of power. It required speed, so Darius built the Royal Road, a highway that stretched more than 1,500 miles from the city of Susa in Persia all the way to the Aegean Sea. Along this road, the Persians established a relay system of stations, each stocked with fresh horses and riders. A message could travel the entire length of the road in about 7 to 9 days. A normal traveler would have taken 3 months. That astonishing speed gave the central government a decisive advantage. News of a rebellion could reach the capital before the rebellion had time to spread. Orders from the king could arrive at a distant satrap almost as fast as a local messenger could carry news from the next village. The Royal Road was not just a road. It was a nervous system that made a far-flung empire feel connected and responsive. Still, even the best roads and the most careful division of power could not guarantee loyalty. How could a king in Persepolis truly know what was happening in a satrapy 1,000 miles away? Darius solved this problem with a remarkably simple tool. He sent out traveling inspectors who became known as the king's eyes and ears. These inspectors were not spies in the shadows. They were official agents, often high-ranking officials or members of the royal family, who traveled throughout the empire unannounced. They could show up at a satrap's palace, examine the tax records, listen to complaints from local villagers, and report back directly to the king. The mere knowledge that such inspections could happen at any time kept provincial governors honest. No satrap could afford to treat his subjects cruelly or divert tax revenues for his own purposes, because the king's eyes might arrive tomorrow. It was a system of accountability that did not rely on torture or terror. It relied on the constant possibility of being watched. To further unify this vast territory, Darius introduced economic standardization. He reformed the system of weights and measures so that a bushel of grain in Egypt meant the same thing as a bushel of grain in Babylon. He also minted a new gold coin called the daric, which was accepted across the entire empire. For the first time, a merchant in Syria could trade with a merchant in Lydia without worrying about different currencies or unclear weights. The daric became a trusted medium of exchange, and that trust made trade flourish. Taxes could now be collected in a consistent form. The royal treasury could maintain accurate accounts. And ordinary people could plan their lives with the confidence that the rules would not change from one province to the next. The genius of Darius was not in conquering new lands, but in making the lands he already held work together. The satrapies, the royal road, the king's eyes, and the daric were all pieces of a single design. A bureaucracy that turned a collection of conquered peoples into a functioning, stable empire. And when the Achaemenid dynasty eventually fell to Alexander, the system did not vanish. Alexander himself kept the satrapies and the road. He understood that the real power of Persia was not in its armies, but in the quiet machinery that had made those armies possible. So what happens when a ruler tries to rule without such machinery, relying only on force? That question leads to a very different kind of story, one about empires that collapsed almost as fast as they rose. Rome understood this lesson better than anyone before or after, but the Eternal City did not build its bureaucratic machine overnight. It took centuries of trial, error, and brutal reform to transform a small republic into an empire that controlled the entire Mediterranean world. And the story of that transformation reveals something surprising. The Roman Republic, before it became an empire, already had the seeds of a sophisticated administrative system woven into its very structure. At the heart of that system was the cursus honorum, which simply means the course of offices. This was a carefully ordered ladder of political positions that every ambitious Roman had to climb, one step at a time. You could not skip a rung. A young man started as a quaestor, a financial administrator who handled public funds and tax records. After that, he might become an aedile, responsible for public buildings, markets, and games. Then came the praetorship, a judicial role that also gave the holder military command. And finally, the ultimate prize, the consulship, the highest elected office in the Republic. This sequential system was not just a tradition, it was a training program. By the time a Roman reached the consulship, he had already spent decades managing money, overseeing construction, judging disputes, and leading soldiers. He knew how the state worked from the inside. He understood the rules, the limits, and the loopholes. The cursus honorum created a class of leaders who were not just politicians but experienced administrators. And that institutional knowledge made the Republic remarkably stable, even during periods of intense internal conflict. But the Republic faced a problem that grew worse with every conquest. As Rome expanded beyond Italy, it needed officials to govern distant provinces. The solution was the proconsular system. After serving as consul, a Roman might be appointed as a proconsul or governor of a province like Sicily, Spain, or Asia. In theory, this was a way to reward experienced leaders and extend Roman authority. In practice, it was a recipe for exploitation. Proconsuls served for a limited term, usually 1 year, and they governed with enormous power over the local population. They commanded the legions in their province, oversaw the courts, and decided how taxes were collected. And because they were far from Rome with little oversight, many saw their year of governance as a chance to get rich. They extracted bribes, seized land, and imposed crushing taxes on the conquered peoples. The system of tax collection itself was deeply flawed. Rome did not employ government tax collectors. Instead, it outsourced the job to private companies called publicani. These were contractors, often wealthy Roman businessmen, who bid for the right to collect taxes in a particular province. The publicani paid a lump sum to the Roman treasury upfront. Then they traveled to the province and collected as much tax as they could, keeping whatever they collected above the original bid. This created a powerful incentive to squeeze every last coin from the local population. The publicani had no loyalty to the provincials. They were not officials. They were businessmen maximizing profit, and they were backed by the authority of Rome. Abuse was not a bug, it was a feature. The tax farmers took more than the law allowed, bribed local officials, and left whole regions impoverished. The provinces groaned under the weight of this system, and resentment simmered. For centuries, the Republic managed to hold things together through a combination of military force, elite networks, and sheer inertia. But the cracks were widening. The publicani and the proconsuls were enriching themselves at the expense of the empire's long-term health. And the common people of Rome, the citizens who had once been the backbone of the Republic, were being squeezed out by wealthy landowners and slave labor. Social unrest grew. Ambitious generals began to use their provincial armies not to defend Rome, but to advance their own careers. The Republic was collapsing under the weight of its own success. And it was at this moment of crisis that a single man reimagined the entire system. When Augustus became the sole ruler of Rome after decades of civil war, he understood that the old republic had failed because its institutions were too weak to control its own officials. The proconsuls had become warlords, the publicani had become parasites, the census, which had once tracked the population for military and tax purposes, had become unreliable. So Augustus began a quiet revolution. He did not abolish the old offices. He kept the Senate, the consuls, even the proconsuls, but he emptied them of real power. Instead, he built a parallel administration that answered directly to him. From this point forward, provinces were divided into two categories. The peaceful ones were still governed by proconsuls appointed by the Senate. But the frontier provinces, where the legions were stationed, were governed by legates chosen personally by Augustus. This meant the military muscle of the empire was now under the direct control of a single authority. No governor could raise an army against Rome because the armies were commanded by men loyal to the emperor. Augustus also reformed the tax system, but he did not simply abolish the publicani. Instead, he gradually replaced them with professional tax collectors who were salaried employees of the state. They did not bid for contracts. They did not profit from extortion. They were paid a fixed wage and held accountable through regular audits. This change, slow and incremental, transformed tax collection from a predatory business into a predictable government function. And at the foundation of this new order was the census. Augustus ordered a vast survey of the entire Roman world. Every province was to count its people, assess their property, and register them for tax purposes. The goal was not just to know how many people lived in the empire, but to know what they owned, where they lived, and how much they could contribute. This census was the backbone of the new imperial bureaucracy. It gave the central government a constantly updated picture of the empire's resources, and it allowed Augustus to plan. He could calculate how much grain Rome needed, how many soldiers he could recruit, and where tax revenue was falling short. The census was not a one-time event. It became a regular practice repeated every few years, and it turned the empire into a data-driven state. To manage this growing administrative load, Augustus created a professional civil service drawn largely from the equestrian class, Rome's wealthy businessmen and landowners who had previously been excluded from high political office. These equestrians were not senators, they were not politicians, they were administrators appointed by the emperor and paid a salary. They served as tax collectors, census takers, financial auditors, and provincial secretaries. For the first time, Rome had a full-time, permanent bureaucracy that did not depend on the ambitions of elected officials. A tax official in Egypt could spend his entire career moving through different posts within the imperial administration. He was not a politician seeking glory. He was a civil servant fulfilling a function, and that function, repeated across the empire, created a layer of stability that the Republic had never known. When a proconsul arrived in his province, he now faced a wall of professional administrators who knew the local tax rolls, the census data, and the legal precedents. He could not simply invent new taxes or ignore old ones. The bureaucracy checked his power. The empire no longer depended on the character of a single governor. It depended on the system that surrounded him. Augustus did not build a perfect machine. Corruption and inefficiency persisted, but he built a machine that could survive bad emperors, incompetent governors, and even civil wars. The professional civil service outlasted the Julio-Claudian dynasty. It outlasted the Flavians. It kept running through the crisis of the 3rd century. And when the Western Empire finally fell, the Eastern half, with its deeper bureaucratic traditions, continued to function for another 1,000 years. The Roman bureaucracy, born from the wreckage of the Republic, became the skeleton that held the empire upright long after the muscle had decayed. But even Rome's system was not unique. Across the Atlantic, another empire was building a bureaucracy so subtle and so efficient that it managed to control millions of people without any written language at all. The Inca had no books, no alphabets, no written words at all. Yet they ruled a territory that stretched more than 2,000 miles along the spine of the Andes, from modern-day Colombia down into Chile. They built mountaintop cities, suspended bridges over bottomless gorges, and fed a population of millions without any of the tools that other empires considered essential. How did they do it? The answer is a set of knotted cords called quipus. At first glance, a quipu looks like a simple fringe, a main cord with dozens of smaller strings hanging from it, each string tied with knots at different positions. But those knots were a sophisticated recording system. The type of knot, its placement, and the color of the string all carried meaning. Different colors represented different categories: red for soldiers, yellow for gold, white for silver. The knots themselves encoded numbers in a decimal system, with each knot representing a digit. A single quipu could record the population of an entire province, the amount of grain stored in a warehouse, or the number of llamas in a royal herd. Quipu keepers, known as quipucamayos, were trained from childhood to read and tie these cords. They were the Incas' equivalent of scribes, and they held immense power. When a Spanish conquistador asked a local chief how many people lived in his valley, the chief did not pull out a book. He reached for a quipu. His fingers ran across the knots, and he gave the answer without hesitation. The Spanish were baffled. They could not believe that a civilization without writing could keep such precise records. But the quipu was only one layer of the Incas' administrative genius. The empire was organized into a decimal hierarchy that turned the entire population into a living ledger. Every 10 households formed a unit with a leader. 10 of those units formed a larger group of 100 households, and so on up to groups of 10,000. Each leader at every level was responsible for reporting to the next rank. Information traveled upward through this chain, and orders traveled downward. The system was so consistent that a governor in the capital city of Cusco could know exactly how many workers were available in a remote valley 2 weeks away. To move people and goods across this vast terrain, the Inca built an extraordinary network of roads. 2 main highways, one along the coast and one through the highlands, ran the length of the empire, with countless smaller roads branching off to connect every corner. Along these roads they constructed tambos, way stations placed about a day's walk apart. Each tambo was a small complex of storehouses, lodgings, and supply depots. Traveling messengers, known as chasquis, could run from one tambo to the next, passing along orders or quipus in a relay system that moved information faster than any empire without horses had ever managed. A message from Cusco could reach the far end of the empire in about 5 days. The roads themselves were engineering marvels. They cut through solid rock, crossed swamps on raised causeways, and spanned rivers with woven grass bridges that were replaced every year. But the real power of the road network was not the roads themselves. It was the system of tambos that turned the roads into a working bureaucracy. Quipucamayos stationed at each tambo kept records of who passed through, what goods were carried, and what was stored. The empire could track a shipment of dried potatoes from the highlands to the coast with the same precision that Rome tracked grain shipments from Egypt. Then there was the mita, the Inca's system of rotational labor. Every household was required to contribute a certain number of days of work each year to the state. But this was not the brutal forced labor that the Spanish later imposed. It was a carefully managed obligation. The decimal hierarchy knew exactly how many workers each community could spare. Some workers built roads or terraces. Others served in the army, worked in mines, or tended royal herds. While they were away, their own fields and households were supported by the stored goods from state warehouses. The mita was a tax paid in labor, and it kept the empire functioning without the need for money or markets. The state collected its tribute in the form of work, and it redistributed that work across the entire territory. This system required an immense amount of coordination, and all of it was tracked with nothing more than knotted cords and the memories of trained quipu. The result was a bureaucracy that was invisible to the eye but as real as stone. When the Spanish arrived, they destroyed much of this system, believing that a people without writing could never have created a true civilization. They were wrong. The Inca bureaucracy was not a primitive substitute for writing. It was a different way of organizing information, one that relied on tactile memory and physical records that could be carried over mountain passes and read by touch in the darkness of a tambo. The quipu was not a limitation. It was a choice, a solution perfectly adapted to the Inca's environment, and it worked. The empire held together for nearly a century before the Spanish conquest, a remarkable span for any pre-industrial state. Even after the empire fell, quipus continued to be used in remote villages for another 200 years. The knots held their meaning long after the rulers who tied them were gone. That durability is the mark of a bureaucracy that truly understood the art of holding an empire together, and it forces us to ask a deeper question. If a system of knotted cords could rival the written records of Rome and China, then what else have we missed? What other silent structures have shaped the human story, hidden in plain sight because they did not fit our expectations? In Constantinople, bureaucracy became an art form that outlasted an empire's fall. By the time the Western Roman provinces had crumbled under the weight of invasions, the eastern half, centered on the city of Constantinople, was just beginning its own remarkable story. The Byzantine Empire, as historians would later call it, did not see itself as a new creation. It was Rome. The same laws, the same administrative traditions, the same sense of imperial destiny, merely transplanted and adapted for a new age. And the key to its astonishing longevity, nearly 1,000 years from the reign of Constantine in the 4th century until the fall of Constantinople in the 15th, was not its walls or its armies. It was the refined and resilient bureaucracy that the Byzantines inherited from Augustus and then perfected. The heart of this system was a collection of specialized departments known in Greek as the logothesia. Each logothesian was an office devoted to a single function. The logothetes tou genikou oversaw the general treasury, tracking tax revenue from across the empire. The logothetes tou stratiotikou managed military pay and supplies. The logothetes tou dromou handled foreign affairs and the Imperial postal service. And the logothetes tou oikou supervised the emperor's personal estates. This division of labor was not mere organizational convenience. It was a deliberate design to prevent any single official from accumulating too much power. A minister of finance could not meddle in military logistics. A diplomat could not raid the treasury. Each department operated like a separate machine within a larger engine, and each reported directly to the emperor. This structure made the Byzantine government remarkably resistant to corruption and inefficiency. When a crisis struck, the emperor knew exactly which office to turn to, and he could replace a failing minister without disrupting the entire state. But the Byzantines went even further than their Roman predecessors. They created a class of administrators who were uniquely positioned to serve the state without personal ambition. These were eunuchs. In many ancient societies, eunuchs served in royal households as guards or attendants, but the Byzantines turned them into a pillar of the bureaucracy. The reasoning was simple and cold. A eunuch could not found a dynasty. He could not pass his office to a son. He had no family interests to advance. His loyalty belonged entirely to the emperor who appointed him. And because eunuchs were often drawn from conquered peoples or from families outside the traditional elite, they had no local power base to exploit. They were outsiders by design, and that made them ideal administrators. They filled many of the highest positions in the logothesia, serving as treasurers, diplomats, and even generals. Their influence was so great that some historians argue the Byzantine bureaucracy owed its stability as much to eunuchs as to any written code. They were a living buffer against the chaos of aristocratic ambition, and yet the most enduring achievement of the Byzantine administrative mind was not its personnel but its codification of law. By the 6th century, Roman law had become a sprawling mountain of edicts, imperial decrees, and jurist interpretations that contradicted each other more often than not. The Emperor Justinian decided to change that. He ordered a commission of legal experts to gather all existing imperial laws, sort them by subject, eliminate what was outdated or contradictory, and produce a single authoritative collection. The result was the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. It was divided into 3 parts. The code contained all the imperial rulings still in force. The digest compiled the opinions of Rome's greatest legal minds, and the institute served as a textbook for students. Together, these texts formed a comprehensive legal system that covered everything from property rights to marriage to criminal procedure. It was clear, consistent, and enforceable, and because it was written down and standardized, it could be applied across the entire empire, from the Greek coast to the mountains of Anatolia. A judge in Thessaloniki could consult the same legal passage as a judge in Antioch. The law no longer depended on the memory or the favor of a local official. It existed as a permanent reference above any individual. The impact of Justinian's legal code was not limited to the Byzantine Empire. It became the foundation of legal systems throughout Europe. When medieval scholars rediscovered Roman law in the 11th century, they turned to the Corpus Juris Civilis. It shaped the development of canon law in the Church. It influenced the codes of France, Germany, and eventually the entire Western legal tradition. The very idea of a written, reasoned, and consistent body of law, applicable to all citizens regardless of status, is a direct inheritance from Byzantine bureaucracy. This layered system of specialized departments, loyal administrators, and codified law allowed the Byzantine Empire to survive crises that would have destroyed any less structured state. It weathered invasions from Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Normans. It survived periods of iconoclasm, civil war, and economic collapse, and each time the empire recovered, not because of a great general or a charismatic emperor, but because the machinery of government kept running. Officials in the logothesia continued to collect taxes. Diplomats continued to send messages along the imperial road system. Judges continued to apply the law. The empire was not a person. It was a process, and that process, perfected over centuries, proved more durable than any throne. When Constantinople finally fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, the bureaucracy did not vanish entirely. The Ottomans themselves admired Byzantine administration. They adopted many of its structures, including the tax registers and the system of provincial governance. The legal traditions of the Corpus Juris Civilis lived on in the courts of Europe, and the idea that a state could be held together by specialized offices, written laws, and professional administrators, rather than by the sheer force of a single ruler, became one of the most influential concepts in human history. The Byzantines did not just preserve Roman bureaucracy, they transformed it into something that could outlast Rome itself, and in doing so, they proved that the quiet machinery of governance is often the most powerful legacy an empire can leave behind. Of all the hidden tools that held empires together, none was more essential than the simple act of counting people. The census was the foundation upon which everything else rested. Without accurate numbers, tax collection became guesswork, resource allocation turned into chaos, and the entire administrative machine ground to a halt. Every stable empire understood this truth, and each developed its own method of taking stock of its population, often with remarkable ingenuity. The Han dynasty of China conducted regular censuses that were among the most detailed in the ancient world. Officials recorded not just the number of households and individuals, but also their ages, occupations, and landholdings. This data allowed the central government to calculate grain taxes, allocate corvée labor for public works, and plan military conscription. The records were kept on wooden slips and bamboo strips, stored in provincial archives where inspectors could audit them. The result was a system of taxation that, while burdensome, was at least predictable. A farmer knew roughly what he owed each year, and the government knew roughly what it could expect. That predictability reduced resentment and made the empire feel fair, even when the rates were high. The Roman census under Augustus was equally ambitious, but it faced a different challenge. The empire was a patchwork of regions with different local customs, currencies, and legal traditions. Augustus needed a unified picture of the entire Mediterranean world, so he ordered a universal census that covered every province. Local officials were required to register every inhabitant, listing their property, family, and slaves. This information was then compiled in Rome, where specialized clerks cross-referenced the returns to detect fraud. If a landowner in Gaul claimed fewer acres than he actually farmed, the discrepancy would show up when compared with neighboring registrations or with reports from the same province the previous year. The census was not a one-time event but a recurring process, and the threat of discovery kept most people honest. The most remarkable census system, however, belonged to the Inca, who had no written language. They solved the problem with quipus, those knotted cords that encoded numbers and categories. Every community was required to report its population and resources to the decimal hierarchy that organized the empire. A quipu in a remote highland village would tie knots on colored strings to record the number of adults, children, llamas, and bushels of potatoes. That quipu would be carried to the next level of administration, where a senior official would read it and combine it with reports from other villages. By the time the information reached the capital at Cusco, the empire had a living ledger of its entire domain, all without a single written word. The accuracy of these records was enforced through a simple but powerful mechanism. If a quipu was found to be incorrect, the quipu who tied it could be punished, sometimes severely. The fear of error, combined with constant cross-checking, meant that the Incas knew more about their population than many later European states. Across the Atlantic, a similar hunger for data emerged in medieval England. The Domesday Book, completed in 1086 under William the Conqueror, was a census of unprecedented detail. Royal commissioners were sent to every corner of England, and they interrogated local juries about who owned what land, how many ploughs were in use, how many peasants lived where, and what the land was worth. The results were recorded in a massive 2-volume manuscript that still survives today. The name Domesday Book came from a popular comparison with the Day of Judgment, because the survey was so thorough and final that there was no appeal. What made the Domesday Book so powerful was not just its size but its purpose. William used it to assess taxes and feudal obligations with a precision that no previous English king had achieved. He could now demand exactly what each manor owed, no more and no less. This eliminated the wiggle room that local lords had exploited for centuries. The survey also made fraud extremely difficult. If a baron claimed his estate was too poor to support the king, the commissioners could pull out the Domesday entry for that very manor and prove otherwise. The book was a weapon against corruption, a tool that turned information into control. All of these censuses faced the same fundamental problem. How do you prevent the people being counted from lying? The answers were remarkably similar across time and geography. The Han used random audits by traveling inspectors. The Romans created multiple copies of each census and compared them year to year. The Inca relied on the severe accountability of quipu. The Normans employed local juries whose members knew one another, making falsehoods hard to keep secret. In every case, the goal was the same: to make cheating so risky that most people chose to comply. And this honesty, enforced by bureaucratic vigilance, allowed the state to tax fairly enough that rebellion remained rare. The shift from tax farming to direct collection in Rome under Augustus was a landmark transformation. Before him, tax collection was outsourced to private contractors, the publicani, who had every incentive to squeeze the population for maximum profit. Augustus replaced them with salaried government officials who answered to the imperial treasury. These officials were not motivated by profit but by career advancement and fear of punishment. They collected what the law required, not what the market would bear. This change turned tax collection from a predatory enterprise into a predictable government function. The same principle would later appear in other empires, including the Byzantine and Ottoman, where state-employed collectors replaced private middlemen. The census was not merely a bureaucratic tool, it was a statement of sovereignty. When a ruler counted his people, he was saying, "I know you, I know what you have, and I know what I can expect from you." That knowledge was power. It allowed the state to plan, to build, to feed its armies, and to respond to crisis. Without the census, every tax was a gamble. With it, the empire could calculate its own strength, and that calculation, repeated generation after generation, was one of the quietest but most enduring sources of stability in the ancient world. Knowing who you ruled was only half the challenge. The other half was making sure everyone measured the same way. An empire could count every person and every bushel of grain, but if a bushel in one province held a different volume than a bushel in another, those numbers meant nothing. They could not be compared, they could not be trusted, and without trust, the entire bureaucratic machine broke down. That is why the most successful early empires invested heavily in standardization. They imposed uniformity not as a petty obsession, but as a survival strategy. They understood that reducing regional variation was the only way to make a far-flung administration work. Nowhere was this lesson applied more ruthlessly than in China under the Qin dynasty. When Qin Shi Huang united the warring states in 221 BC, he inherited a land of chaos. Each former kingdom had its own writing system, its own axle lengths for carts, its own weights and measures, even its own laws. A merchant traveling from one region to another could not trust the local currency or the local scale. The empire was a patchwork of incompatible systems. Qin Shi Huang did not tolerate that. He ordered the standardization of writing scripts, decreeing that a single script, known as small seal script, would be used throughout the land. He mandated that all cart axles be built to the same width, so that vehicles could roll along the imperial roads without getting stuck in ruts of different sizes. He imposed uniform weights and measures, so a pound of grain in the north meant the same as a pound of grain in the south, and he even standardized the length of a step and the width of a road. The goal was not convenience, it was control. When every province used the same writing, the imperial decrees could be understood everywhere without translation. When every scale weighed the same, tax collectors could not cheat by using heavier stones in one district and lighter ones in another. The empire became a single operating system, and that made governance predictable and efficient. Centuries earlier and half a world away, the Achaemenid Persians had reached the same conclusion. Their tool was the daric, a gold coin minted under Darius I. Before the daric, trade across the Persian Empire relied on barter or on a confusing jumble of local coinages. A merchant in Babylon might accept Lydian coins, but he would have to weigh them and test their purity before any transaction. This slowed commerce and made tax collection a nightmare. The daric solved that problem. It was a coin of consistent weight and purity, accepted across the entire empire. A satrap could collect taxes in darics, ship them to the royal treasury, and know exactly what they were worth. A merchant in Egypt could pay for goods from India using the same currency. The daric became a universal language of value. It did not eliminate local currencies entirely, but it created a standard that everyone trusted, and that trust lubricated the gears of the bureaucracy. Tax assessments, military salaries, and state-sponsored projects could now be calculated and executed without constant haggling over exchange rates. The daric was not just money. It was a bureaucratic tool that made the empire run smoother. The Romans took this idea of uniformity to the physical infrastructure itself. Their roads were famously straight and solid, but they were also built to a consistent gauge. The width of a Roman road was standardized, typically about 4 to 5 meters wide, enough for 2 wagons to pass. More importantly, the roads were measured in Roman miles, a unit of 1,000 paces, and marked with milestones. A traveler, a soldier, or a messenger always knew the distance to the next town or the next way station. This consistency allowed the Imperial Post Service, the cursus publicus, to operate on precise schedules. A relay rider could calculate his travel time, change horses at predictable intervals, and deliver messages with remarkable speed. The bureaucracy depended on that speed. When the emperor in Rome sent a dispatch to the governor of Britain, he needed to know how many days it would take to arrive. The standard road gauge and the standard mile made that calculation possible. Without that uniformity, the entire system would have been a gamble. But the most astonishing example of standardization came from the Incas, who had no writing and no wheeled vehicles. Their road network was a masterpiece of bureaucratic uniformity. The 2 main highways, one along the coast and one through the Andes, were built to a consistent width. In open terrain, the road was wide enough for runners to pass each other comfortably. In mountainous stretches, the road narrowed, but always maintained a uniform design, with retaining walls, drainage channels, and rest stops placed at regular intervals. Every tambo, the way stations, was stocked with the same supplies and run according to the same rules. The chasqui runners who carried messages and quipus followed a fixed rhythm. A runner would sprint from one tambo to the next, covering about 1.5 kilometers, then hand off his load to the next runner. The entire system was timed. A message from Cusco to the far north arrived in roughly the same number of days every time. That predictability was essential. The Inca bureaucracy could plan military campaigns, food redistributions, and labor rotations because they knew exactly how long information would take to travel. All of these empires discovered the same truth. Uniformity transforms a collection of territories into a single system. It allows a tax collector in one province to use the same forms as his counterpart 1,000 miles away. It allows a road builder in one region to know the width and materials his colleagues use elsewhere. It allows a governor to read a decree from the capital without needing a translator. And it allows the central government to compare data from every corner of the empire because the numbers are expressed in the same units. Without that uniformity, bureaucracy becomes a guessing game. With it, bureaucracy becomes a reliable machine. The Qin dynasty standardized writing and axle widths. The Achaemenids standardized currency. The Romans standardized roads and measurement. The Incas standardized their entire network of movement and storage. Each solved the same problem in their own way, and each left behind a legacy of order that made the impossible task of ruling millions feel, at least for a time, almost routine. But systems are only as good as the people who run them. All the standardized weights, the detailed censuses, and the knotted cords in the world meant nothing if the officials tasked with using them had no idea what they were doing. The most sophisticated early empires understood this intimately. They knew that a bureaucracy built on ignorance is a castle built on sand. So they invested heavily in education, not as a luxury, but as a fundamental pillar of statecraft. They created schools, curricula, and training programs designed to produce a single output, a loyal, competent, and interchangeable administrator who could be dropped into any province and perform the same duties with the same level of skill. This shared intellectual culture was the glue that held the administrative class together across vast distances and centuries of change. Nowhere was this investment more rigorous than in Han Dynasty China. The civil service examination system was not simply a test of memory. It was a demanding, multi-year immersion in the Confucian classics. Candidates had to memorize the 5 classics, texts that covered history, poetry, rituals, and moral philosophy. They had to analyze complex passages, compose essays on statecraft, and demonstrate an understanding of proper governance as defined by Confucius and his followers. The exam was not a test of creativity or innovation. It was a test of conformity to a single, state-approved worldview, and that was exactly the point. When an official passed the exam, the emperor knew that this man had internalized the same values as every other scholar official in the empire. He would make decisions based on the same ethical framework. He would interpret situations using the same precedents. He would communicate with colleagues in the same literary language, a refined form of classical Chinese that was unintelligible to commoners but perfectly clear to other officials. This uniformity of thought was the foundation of Han stability. A governor in the far south and a minister in the capital could read the same documents and reach the same conclusions, not because they were forced to, but because their minds had been shaped by the same books. Half a world away, the Mauryan Empire took a different but equally deliberate approach. Kautilya's Arthashastra devotes entire chapters to the training of administrators. Princes and high-ranking officials were required to study not only statecraft and economics, but also logic, philosophy, and military strategy. They were trained in the art of surveillance, learning how to detect corruption and root out disloyalty. But more importantly, they were educated in a common legal and administrative framework. The Arthashastra itself served as a textbook, a manual that laid out the rules for every conceivable situation. By studying it, a young administrator absorbed the same procedures and the same principles as every other official in the empire. When he was sent to govern a distant province, he did not make up rules as he went along. He followed the book. This created a predictability that allowed the Mauryan state to function across a subcontinent of immense diversity. The administrator did not need to rely on local customs or personal judgment. He could refer to the standard operating procedures encoded in his training. In Rome, the path to high office was paved with a specific kind of education reserved for the patrician class. Young men from wealthy families were taught by private tutors or in schools that emphasized rhetoric, law, and public speaking. Rhetoric was not just about making speeches. It was about persuasion, argumentation, and the ability to present a case clearly and logically. These skills were essential in the law courts and the Senate, where decisions were made through debate. Law was even more central. Future magistrates memorized the 12 tables and later the complex body of jurisprudence that grew around them. They learned how to interpret statutes, how to weigh evidence, and how to apply legal principles to real cases. This legal education was not theoretical, it was intensely practical. When a young Roman became a quaestor or a praetor, he had already spent years analyzing legal problems. He knew how the system worked because he had been trained to think like a Roman judge, and because that training was standardized across the elite. A senator from Spain and a senator from Syria could argue a point of law with the same vocabulary and the same reference points. The shared legal culture of Rome was a bond that held the empire together, even when political loyalties fractured. The Byzantine Empire took Roman education and elevated it into a state-sponsored system. In the 5th century, the Emperor Theodosius II founded a university in Constantinople that became the intellectual heart of the empire. It had chairs in Greek and Latin grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, and law. The curriculum was designed to produce exactly the kind of sophisticated administrators the Byzantine bureaucracy needed. Students studied Plato and Aristotle alongside the Corpus Juris Civilis. They learned to write official documents in the formal, elegant style that the imperial chancery demanded. They practiced debating hypothetical cases, honing the analytical skills they would need as judges and governors. The university was not a private academy. It was a state institution funded by the treasury and directly controlled by the emperor. Graduates were expected to enter imperial service. They carried with them not just knowledge but an identity. They were Romans, heirs to 1,000 years of administrative tradition. This sense of shared heritage made the bureaucracy a cohesive class. An official stationed in Antioch and another in Thessaloniki both saw themselves as servants of the same empire, bound by the same education, the same laws, and the same loyalty to the emperor in Constantinople. The result of all this training was not just competence, it was a kind of intellectual unity that transcended geography. A Han scholar official could be transferred from the Yellow River to the Yangtze and find that his new colleagues thought the same way he did. A Mauryan administrator could read the Arthashastra and know exactly what his counterpart in a different province was doing. A Roman praetor could argue a case in Gaul using the same legal principles he had learned in Rome. A Byzantine logothetes could write a memorandum that would be understood perfectly by the emperor's secretaries. This shared culture made the empire possible. It turned a collection of individuals into a single, self-perpetuating administrative class, a machine made of minds, all running the same internal software. And that machine, once built, could survive changes of dynasty, invasions, and even the collapse of the empire that created it. The education of the bureaucrat was the most durable investment an ancient state could make. It did not just fill positions, it created a tradition that could outlive the throne itself. Speed was the skeleton of power. An empire could have the best laws, the most honest tax collectors, and the most brilliantly trained officials. But if news of a rebellion took months to reach the capital, the empire was already dead. It just did not know it yet. That is why every stable early empire invested heavily in one invisible infrastructure, the communications network. They built relay systems that moved information faster than any army could march, and they understood that this speed was not a luxury. It was the difference between holding a territory and losing it. The Persians under the Achaemenid dynasty were the first to perfect this on a grand scale. They created a system called the Angarium, a network of mounted couriers who rode along the royal road in a relay. At each station, a fresh horse and a fresh rider waited. The messenger would hand off his dispatch and the new rider would gallop off immediately. This meant the horses never tired and the messages never slowed. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stayed these couriers from their appointed rounds. That phrase would later become the unofficial motto of the United States Postal Service, but its origins lie in the dusty roads of Persia. The Angarium allowed the great king in Persepolis to receive news from Sardis, over 1,500 miles away, in about a week. That was a speed that no invading army could match. When a revolt broke out in a distant satrapy, the king knew about it before the rebels could coordinate with neighboring provinces. He could dispatch orders, gather troops, and crush the uprising before it spread. The Angarium was not just a postal system, it was a weapon of preemptive control. The Romans took this idea and built it into something even more systematic. They called it the cursus publicus, the public course. This was a state-run courier and transport network that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates. Along the major roads, the Romans constructed way stations called mansions, which were essentially inns with stables, repair shops, and lodging. Every 12 to 18 miles, there was a mutation, a smaller station where horses could be changed. The system was strictly regulated. Only official travelers with a special permit, a diploma, could use the cursus publicus. These permits specified how many horses, wagons, or mules the traveler was authorized to use. This prevented abuse. A governor could not commandeer the entire network for his personal baggage. The system was reserved for imperial business. The result was astonishing efficiency. A message could travel from Rome to the province of Britain in about a week during summer. In winter, it might take 2, but that was still faster than any alternative. The cursus publicus allowed the emperor to communicate with his legates in real time, as real as any ancient technology could offer. When a frontier garrison needed reinforcements, the request could reach Rome, and a response could be on its way before the local crisis turned into a full-scale invasion. The network also allowed the central government to audit its own officials. A censor could travel from station to station, checking records, and his reports could be sent back to Rome with the same speed. The cursus publicus was the nervous system of the Roman Empire. Without it, the vast territory would have been a collection of isolated provinces, each drifting further from the center with every passing year. On the other side of the world, the Inca built a system that rivaled Rome's, but without horses. The Inca had no horses, no wheeled vehicles, no iron. What they had was the chasqui, a trained runner who could cover mountain passes and suspension bridges at a pace that amazed European observers. The chasquis were stationed at intervals of about 1.5 kilometers along the Inca road network. Each runner lived in a small hut at his assigned post, ready to sprint at a moment's notice. When a message arrived, the chasqui would memorize it or carry a quipu, then run to the next station and pass it on. The relay was so fast that fresh fish from the coast could reach the emperor's table in Cusco, high in the Andes, within 48 hours, a distance that would take a normal traveler a week. This speed was not just for royal convenience, it was for control. When a rebellion broke out in a distant province, the Sapa Inca in Cusco could receive the news within days and dispatch orders back just as quickly. The chasquis allowed the empire to respond to threats before they became unstoppable. They also kept the bureaucracy running. Tax records, census data, and legal judgments all traveled along this human network. The chasqui was the living equivalent of a data cable, and the Inca Empire depended on him absolutely. In China, the system evolved over centuries. The Zhou dynasty had relay stations, but it was the Qin and Han that turned them into a true imperial network. Along the major roads, they built postal stations called yi, spaced at regular intervals. Each station had horses, carts, and lodging for official travelers. The system was hierarchical. There were large stations that could handle dozens of horses and smaller ones for quick changes. Officials carried credentials that authorized their use of the network, and any misuse was punished severely. The Chinese relay system was not just for messages, it also moved goods. Tax grain, tribute items, and government supplies traveled along the same roads using the same stations. This integrated logistics and communication into a single system. A governor could send a report to the capital and receive a shipment of seed grain for his province on the same network. The coordination was remarkable. By the Tang dynasty, the Chinese postal system employed tens of thousands of people and covered over 30,000 miles of roads. A message could travel from the capital at Chang'an to the furthest frontier in about 2 weeks. That speed allowed the central government to maintain a grip on a territory larger than Europe. All these empires built their communications networks for the same reason. They knew that information is the most perishable resource. A month-old report is useless. A week-old report is better. A day-old report is gold. The faster the news traveled, the more control the center could exert, and the more control the center exerted, the more stable the empire became. The Angarium, the cursus publicus, the chasquis, and the stations were not just infrastructure. They were the arteries through which the lifeblood of authority flowed. And when those arteries clogged, when messages slowed or stopped, the empire began to die. But as long as the information moved fast, the center could think, decide, and act before the periphery slipped away. Speed was not just an advantage, it was the very condition of empire. But speed alone could not prevent betrayal from within. The fastest roads and the swiftest messengers meant nothing if the officials receiving those messages were themselves the enemy. Every stable empire knew that the greatest threat to its survival was not the barbarian at the gate, but the governor who smiled while quietly building his own treasure and his own army. So these states built a second invisible infrastructure, a network of internal surveillance that watched the watchers. They created inspectors, spies, and agents whose sole purpose was to keep the bureaucracy honest by making every official feel that eyes were always on him. This was not paranoia, it was a calculated system of deterrence, and it worked for centuries, though at a cost that some empires paid dearly. The Roman approach to internal surveillance evolved slowly at first. The frumentarii were originally grain collectors, soldiers tasked with procuring wheat for the army. But because they traveled constantly across the provinces, they naturally picked up information. By the 2nd century, the emperors had transformed them into a full-fledged intelligence service. The frumentarii reported on provincial governors, military commanders, and even senators. They could appear without warning in a distant city, audit the local accounts, and forward their findings directly to Rome. A governor never knew if the traveler asking for lodging was a simple merchant or one of the emperor's eyes. This uncertainty kept many officials from crossing the line. The system was efficient, but it also bred resentment. The frumentarii were feared, not respected, and their power invited abuse. They could blackmail a corrupt official or frame an innocent one. The Emperor Commodus found the frumentarii so dangerous that he disbanded them, but the need for surveillance did not disappear. His successors created a replacement called the agents in rebus, the agents of affairs. These men were professional imperial messengers who also served as inspectors. They carried the emperor's authority into every corner of the empire, and their reports carried the weight of law. The agents in rebus were more tightly controlled than the frumentarii, but they still inspired a chill wherever they appeared. A provincial governor knew that a single unfavorable report could end his career and maybe his life. The system encouraged caution, but it also encouraged flattery and paranoia. Governors began to treat every stranger as a potential spy, and the atmosphere of distrust sometimes corroded the very honesty the system was meant to protect. In Han China, the role of internal surveillance fell to a specialized corps of censors. These were officials who answered not to the provincial administration but directly to the emperor. They traveled the empire, auditing tax records, reviewing legal cases, and hearing petitions from common people. Their power was immense. A censor could recommend the dismissal of a governor, the confiscation of property, or even the execution of a corrupt official. The mere existence of the censors acted as a powerful deterrent. A governor in a distant commandery knew that the censors might arrive at any moment. He could not afford to alienate his subjects because they could appeal directly to the censor. The Han system was remarkably effective at preventing the sort of regional independence that had plagued earlier dynasties. But it also had a darker side. Censors could be bribed, they could be manipulated by rival officials, and when the central government weakened, the censors sometimes became their own power base, using their authority to settle personal scores. The system required a strong emperor to keep the censors themselves in check. When the throne grew weak, the censors became just another faction in a corrupt court. The Mauryan Empire took a more systematic and secretive approach. The Arthashastra, the Manual of Statecraft, devotes extensive chapters to the use of spies. Cortelier argued that a king must always know what his officials are thinking, and the only way to know is through informants. So the Mauryan state employed a vast network of spies who were not uniformed agents but ordinary people. Merchants, monks, beggars, entertainers, anyone could be a royal informant. These spies did not operate out of a central office. they were recruited locally, given a cover story, and instructed to report anything suspicious. They watched the governors, they watched the generals, they watched the tax collectors, and they watched each other. The Arthashastra even advises that spies should be planted to report on other spies. The goal was to create a web of mutual suspicion so thick that no single official could coordinate a rebellion. The system was brutally effective at maintaining control, but it also created a culture of fear. No one trusted anyone fully. The empire ran smoothly, but at the price of a deep social paranoia. Cortelyar understood this trade-off and accepted it. He believed that a stable empire was worth the cost of constant vigilance. The Achaemenid Persians used a lighter touch, but their method was no less powerful. They had the king's eyes and ears, traveling inspectors who toured the satrapies and reported directly to the monarch. These inspectors were not secret. They were official, they carried royal credentials and were expected to be seen. When they arrived in a province, they would hold a public audience, listen to complaints, and review the satrap's accounts. The transparency of this process was itself a deterrent. A satrap could not hide his actions from the king's eyes because everyone in the province knew they could speak to the inspector. The Persians understood that surveillance works best when it is visible. The threat of exposure was often enough to prevent misconduct, but the system had limits. The inspectors were chosen from the highest ranks of the Persian nobility, and they sometimes protected their own friends or exacted revenge on enemies. The king's eyes could be blinded by their own ambitions. Still, the Achaemenid model remained remarkably stable for over 2 centuries, in part because the system of inspection was woven into the cultural expectation of justice. A satrap who governed fairly had nothing to fear from the inspector. Only the corrupt had reason to worry. All these systems shared a common logic. An empire could not rely on the goodwill of its officials. Power corrupts, and distance magnifies that corruption. The only solution was to create a parallel system of oversight that operated independently of the regular administration. Whether through Roman frumentarii, hand censors, Mauryan spies, or Persian inspectors, the goal was the same: make every governor feel that he is being watched, and he will govern as if watched always. The system worked, but it also introduced a new danger. The watchers themselves needed to be watched. When the surveillance network became a weapon of personal ambition or factional rivalry, it turned the empire against itself. The Roman frumentarii were disbanded because they had become a secret police that terrorized the capital. The hand censors sometimes became a shadow court that undermined the emperor's authority. The Mauryan web of spies could not be turned off, and it left a legacy of suspicion that outlasted the empire itself. The Achaemenid system avoided the worst of these abuses, perhaps because it remained a public institution rather than a secret one. But even the king's eyes were not immune to corruption. The lesson was clear: internal surveillance is a double-edged sword. It preserves the empire by discouraging betrayal, but it can also poison the trust that makes empire worth preserving. The most successful empires walked this line carefully, always aware that the same tool that kept governors honest could also become the instrument of their downfall. Surveillance kept officials honest, but written law made their decisions predictable, and predictability, more than kindness or fear, was the true currency of stable empire. A governor could be watched, but without a clear set of rules, his judgments would be arbitrary, shaped by his mood, his prejudice, or his bribe. The people under his authority would never know what to expect, and that uncertainty bred resentment and rebellion. The solution, refined across every major early empire, was the written legal code. It was a system of laws that existed independently of any ruler, carved into stone, written on papyrus, or inscribed on bronze tablets. It told every citizen and every official, from the emperor down to the lowest tax collector, exactly what was permitted and what was forbidden. It made governance a matter of reference, not whim. And it allowed an empire to function even when the king was far away or dead, or too busy to decide every small dispute himself. The earliest surviving example of this principle is the Code of Hammurabi, carved into a massive black stone pillar around 1750 BC in ancient Babylon. Hammurabi did not invent the idea of law, but he was the first known ruler to gather all the existing rules of his kingdom into a single, publicly displayed text. The code listed nearly 300 specific rulings, covering everything from trade contracts to property damage to family disputes. The famous principle of an eye for an eye was not a prescription for vengeance. It was a way of standardizing punishment. Before the code, a wealthy man who injured a commoner might face no consequence at all. After the code, the penalty was fixed and known to everyone. A judge could no longer invent a punishment based on who the victim was. He had to follow the text. That consistency made the legal system feel fair, even when the punishments were harsh. And because the code was displayed publicly, any citizen could read it or have it read to them and know their rights. The ruler did not need to be present in every village. The law spoke for him. Centuries later and half a world away, the Roman Republic produced its own foundational legal document, the 12 Tables. Around 450 BCE, after a long struggle between the patrician and plebeian classes, the Romans inscribed their laws onto 12 bronze tablets and set them up in the Forum for all to see. Before the 12 Tables, Roman law was secret, known only to patrician priests who could twist its interpretation to favor their own class. The plebeians demanded transparency, and the 12 Tables gave it to them. The laws were concise and blunt. They covered debt, property, inheritance, and family life. If a man defaulted on a loan, the creditor could seize him, but only after a public proceeding. If a father sold his son into slavery, he lost his paternal rights. The 12 Tables did not create a perfect legal system, but they created a predictable one. A Roman citizen could now argue his case in court using the same text that the judge would consult. The law was no longer a mystery controlled by a few. It was a public document, and that transparency was the bedrock of Roman legal culture for centuries. Whenever Rome conquered a new territory, local officials did not invent new laws. They applied the principles of the 12 Tables, adapted through later legal developments, to the local situation. A Roman governor in Gaul could resolve a dispute between two Gauls using a legal framework that was consistent with what a governor in Syria would do. That uniformity made Roman rule feel less arbitrary than the rule of local chieftains had been. In China, the tension between Confucian ethics and legalist philosophy produced a unique fusion. The early Qin dynasty had relied on harsh, uniform legalist codes that left little room for interpretation. Every crime had a fixed punishment, and judges were expected to apply the law mechanically. This created predictability but also cruelty. When the Han dynasty replaced the Qin, they retained the idea of a written legal code but softened it with Confucian values. Judges were now allowed to consider intent and circumstance. A man who killed in self-defense was treated differently from a man who killed for profit. The code itself became a thick volume of statutes and commentaries, studied by every aspiring official. A county magistrate did not need to consult the emperor every time a dispute arose. He opened the code, found the relevant statute, and applied it according to the principles he had learned in his training. This combination of codified law and ethical interpretation made the Han legal system both consistent and humane. It allowed justice to be administered locally without constant reference to the capital, and that speed of resolution kept the population satisfied. The law was not the emperor's personal will. It was a system that existed above any individual ruler, and that gave it authority even when the throne was occupied by a child or a tyrant. India followed its own path with the Dharmasastra, a vast body of texts that laid out the rules for righteous conduct. The most famous of these is the Manus Mriti, or the Laws of Manu, which dates from roughly the 2nd century BC to the 3rd century CE. These texts were not state legislation in the Roman or Chinese sense. They were compilations of religious and social customs, believed to be divinely revealed, that governed everything from marriage to trade to criminal punishment. But they served the same function as a legal code. They provided a fixed reference point. A king was expected to rule according to the Dharmasastra. A judge consulted it to resolve disputes. Individuals used it to know their duties and rights. Unlike the Roman 12 tables, the Manus Mriti was not set up in a public square. It was preserved by Brahmin scholars and taught to rulers and administrators. But its influence was just as powerful. It created a framework of expectations that made governance predictable. A merchant in one kingdom knew that the rules of debt and contract in the next kingdom would be similar because both followed the same textual tradition. The Dharmasastra did not eliminate local variation, but it provided a common language of justice that allowed the Mauryan and later Gupta empires to hold together a diverse subcontinent. What all these legal codes achieved was a transfer of authority from the person of the ruler to the text of the law. An official in a distant province did not need to wait for a letter from the palace. He had the code in his archive. He could read it, apply it, and move on. The law became a substitute for the ruler's presence. It made governance scalable. It allowed an empire to grow without collapsing under the weight of its own decisions. And it gave ordinary people a basis for trusting the system, because the rules were the same for everyone, at least in principle. The code was not perfect, and justice was not always equal. But the idea that a written law existed, that it could be consulted and quoted, was a revolution in human organization. It turned governance from a personal relationship into a mechanical process. And that process, repeated millions of times across centuries, was one of the quietest but most powerful forces holding early empires together. The code did not just tell people what to do. It told them what to expect from each other and from the state, and in that predictability lay the deepest kind of stability. But these systems were never as perfect as the manuals suggested. For every official who followed the law with precision, there was another who found a way to bend it to his own advantage. For every smoothly running tax collection, there was a village ground down by corruption. The hidden bureaucracies that held empires together were also the places where those empires frayed and sometimes broke. Examining those weaknesses does not diminish the achievements of these systems. It makes them human. It reveals that stability was never a given. It was something that had to be constantly fought for and sometimes lost. In Rome, the tax farming system of the publicani was a corruption machine disguised as a business arrangement. These private contractors bid for the right to collect taxes in a province, paid the treasury upfront, and then set out to recover their investment with profit. They had no loyalty to the people they taxed. They only cared about the bottom line, so they squeezed. They demanded more than the legal rate. They seized property as collateral for debts that had not yet come due. They bribed local officials to look the other way. When a province was assigned to a publicanus, the inhabitants knew they were about to be stripped of everything they had. The resentment that built up over generations did not stay contained. It fueled rebellions in Gaul, in Spain, and in Asia Minor. Rome eventually reformed the system under Augustus, replacing the publicani with salaried state employees. But the damage had already been done. The provinces never fully forgot the years of exploitation, and the memory of that corruption lingered like a scar on the imperial body. In Han China, the civil service examination system was a triumph of meritocratic ideals. But ideals have a way of decaying when they meet reality. Over time, the exams became less a test of ability and more a test of family resources. A candidate needed years of study, access to rare books, and the leisure to prepare. Wealthy families could afford tutors and could support a son while he spent a decade memorizing the classics. Poor families could not. The exam system became a tool of the elite, not a ladder for the talented, and even among those who passed, connections mattered. A graduate from a prominent family had an easier path to promotion than a graduate from a humble village. The system of recommendation and patronage that surrounded the exams meant that cronyism crept in. An official who owed his position to a powerful patron was loyal to that patron, not to the state. The censors, who were supposed to keep officials honest, sometimes became part of the problem. They could be bribed, they could be swayed by family ties. The Han bureaucracy remained effective for centuries, but its purity eroded with each generation. The examination system did not collapse the dynasty by itself, but it did weaken the bond of trust between the central government and the people it ruled. In Constantinople, the Byzantine bureaucracy grew so vast and intricate that it began to suffocate itself. Over the centuries, the logothesia multiplied. Each new department created its own paperwork, its own forms, its own procedures. Officials spent more time filling out reports than administering anything. The system became a machine that consumed its own output. To get anything done, a citizen needed to navigate a labyrinth of offices, each one demanding a fee, a bribe, or a favor. Corruption became an accepted part of daily operation. A merchant waiting for a permit knew that a gift to the right clerk would speed things along. A farmer appealing a tax assessment knew that an offering to the right official might lighten his burden. The state itself was not overtly cruel, but its indifference was a kind of cruelty. When the empire faced external threats, the bureaucracy could not respond quickly because every decision had to pass through too many layers. The machinery of governance, once a source of strength, became a source of paralysis. The Byzantine Empire did not fall because of bureaucratic bloat alone, but the bloat made it harder to adapt, harder to reform, and harder to survive when the walls were finally breached. In the Andes, the Inca Quipus system was a masterpiece of record-keeping without writing, but it had a fatal fragility. A quipu was a physical object. A string could break, a knot could come loose, a color could fade. If a quipu was damaged or lost, the information it contained was gone forever. There were no backup copies. The quipukamayaks who tied the knots were trained to memorize the data, but memory is not permanent. Illness, age, or accident could erase years of accumulated knowledge. When a quipukamayak died without training a successor, his entire quipu became a silent artifact, a record that no one could read. The Spanish conquest accelerated this loss, but the fragility was built into the system from the start. The Inca Empire compensated with redundancy, with multiple quipus and multiple keepers, but the fundamental vulnerability remained. The system worked only as long as the human and material chain stayed intact. When it broke, the empire went blind. All these failures share a common thread. The same systems that created stability also created opportunities for corruption, inertia, and loss. The publicani exploited their power because the system rewarded exploitation. The Han exams drifted toward privilege because privilege pays. The Byzantine offices multiplied because multiplication was easier than reform. The Inca quipus frayed because physical objects always do. These were not bugs introduced later. They were features of the design, consequences of the very choices that made the systems effective in the first place. The empires that survived longest were those that recognized these weaknesses and adapted. Augustus replaced the publicani with salaried collectors. The Tang dynasty reformed the exam system to reduce the influence of powerful families. The Byzantines periodically attempted to streamline their bureaucracy, though with mixed results. The Inca trained multiple quipukamayaks in each community and stored duplicate quipus in regional centers. These reforms did not eliminate the weaknesses, but they delayed collapse, and that delay is itself a lesson. Bureaucracy is never a finished project. It is a living, breathing thing that must be constantly tended, pruned, and repaired. The moment an empire stopped paying attention to its own machinery, the machinery began to rust. And rust left unchecked eventually eats through everything. The same rust that ate through every bureaucracy eventually consumed the empires themselves. But the end was rarely a single dramatic event. It was a long unraveling, a slow collapse where the very systems that had held things together became the instruments of destruction. And when the empires fell, they did not just take their armies and their kings with them. They took their records, the paper, the clay, the knotted cords, the carved stone that had once made governance possible, all scattered, rotted, or were deliberately erased. What survived was a fragment, a whisper of what had once been a loud and intricate machine. For historians, reconstructing these hidden bureaucracies is like trying to assemble a massive jigsaw puzzle when most of the pieces have been burned, buried, or ground to dust. The Roman administrative system did not fall to a single barbarian invasion. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, each invasion severing another link in the chain of communication, another road, another station, another archive. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410, they did not just loot treasure, they destroyed government buildings where tax records were stored. The loss was not just physical. It was informational. The Roman state had relied on a vast library of census data, legal judgments, and correspondence to function. Once those records were gone, the central government could no longer know who owed what or where its loyal officials were stationed. The empire did not vanish overnight. It shrank. Provinces that had once sent regular reports to Rome began to fall silent. The cursus publicus, the imperial postal service, could not operate without secure roads and reliable stations. One by one, the stations were abandoned or destroyed. The network collapsed, and with it, the ability to coordinate defense, collect taxes, or even communicate across the shrinking territory. By the time the last Western emperor was deposed in 476, the bureaucracy was already a ghost. The eastern half survived because its administrative core in Constantinople was better protected, but even there, the loss of the Western archives left a silence that historians still struggle to fill. In China, the Han dynasty did not fall to a sudden invasion. It rotted from within. The bureaucratic machinery that had once been the empire's greatest strength became its heaviest burden. The examination system, once a meritocratic ideal, had become a vehicle for aristocratic privilege. The censors, once the eyes of the emperor, had become a network of patronage and intrigue. The tax system, once predictable, had become a tool for local elites to enrich themselves at the expense of the central treasury. The result was a slow, grinding collapse that spanned decades. Peasant rebellions erupted, not because the people hated the emperor, but because they could no longer bear the weight of a corrupt bureaucracy that took their grain and gave nothing back. When the Han finally fell in 220, the chaos that followed was not a clean break. It was a long period of fragmentation known as the Three Kingdoms, during which the imperial archives were looted, scattered, and burned. The systematic records that the Han had kept for 4 centuries were lost. Future dynasties tried to reconstruct them, but they could only piece together fragments from memory and from surviving copies that had been hidden in private libraries. The loss of the Han census data alone left a gap in Chinese history that has never been fully filled. And that gap is not just a list of numbers. It is the story of how millions of people lived, worked, and died, erased because the paper that held their names was fed to the flames of civil war. The Inca collapse was the most violent and the most complete. When Francisco Pizarro and his small band of conquistadors arrived in the 1530s, they brought steel, gunpowder, and, crucially, disease. But they also brought something else, a deliberate policy of destruction. The Spanish understood that the Inca Quipus were the backbone of the empire. Without them, the Inca could not collect taxes, mobilize labor, or even count their own people. So the conquerors set out to destroy them. They burned Quipus by the thousands. They executed the quipucamayaks who knew how to read them. They declared the knotted cords to be instruments of idolatry and superstition, tools of the devil. The Spanish substitution was their own written records, which they used to control the land and the people. But in destroying the Quipus, they did not just destroy an administrative system. They destroyed an entire way of knowing. The Inca had no written history, no books of chronicles. Their past was woven into the knots. When those knots were burned, the memory of a civilization went with them. The Quipus that survive today, only a few hundred, are mostly untranslated. They are silent witnesses to a lost world, and the challenge of reading them is immense. Without a living quipucamayak to explain the code, historians are left with guesswork. They can deduce the numbers, but the categories, the names, the meaning behind the colors, all of that is gone. The Inca bureaucracy was erased so thoroughly that we may never fully understand how it worked. The loss of these archives is not just a tragedy for scholars. It is a fundamental gap in our understanding of how humans have organized themselves. Every empire that fell took its administrative memory with it, the Roman tax rolls that could have told us the price of bread in every province. Gone, the hand census that could have revealed population density along the Silk Road. Burned, the Mauryan spy reports that could have shown us how information traveled across India. Pulverized by time and conquest, what remains is what happened to survive by accident. A cache of clay tablets buried under a collapsed palace in Mesopotamia. A set of bamboo slips sealed in a tomb in central China. A handful of quipus hidden in a mountain cave in Peru. These fragments are the clues, but they are maddeningly incomplete. They tell us that a system existed, but they cannot tell us how it felt to live inside it. They show us the numbers, but not the faces, and so historians are left with a puzzle. They must reconstruct the invisible machinery of empire from the broken pieces that the past has left behind. It is a detective story without a clear ending. Every discovery raises new questions. Every translation reveals new gaps. The hidden bureaucracies that once held the world together are now themselves hidden, buried under the sediment of centuries. And the only way to find them is to keep digging, keep questioning, and keep wondering what else might still be waiting in the dark. And sometimes the digging yields astonishing returns. The broken tablets, the charred bamboo, the faded knots, they are not just relics, they are data waiting to be decoded. Over the past century, a quiet revolution has transformed how we understand these hidden bureaucracies. It is a revolution driven not by new battles or new kings, but by the painstaking work of archaeologists and historians who treat every fragment as a clue. Their discoveries have pulled back the curtain on the administrative machinery that earlier generations could only guess at. Consider the Shuihudi bamboo slips. In 1975, Chinese workers digging a well in Hubei province uncovered a waterlogged tomb dating from the Qin dynasty, around 217 years before the Common Era. Inside, they found over 1,000 bamboo strips neatly bound together, covered in ink. These were not poems or philosophical treatises, they were legal documents. Statutes on agriculture, on currency, on the punishment of thieves. Administrative records of how a local official managed his district. The slips contained laws that historians had only read about in later books, but here they were, contemporary and unaltered. They showed that the Qin legal system was even more detailed and standardized than previously believed. A single slip might list the exact fine for selling rotten grain, or the procedure for inspecting a horse before a military campaign. The bamboo had been preserved by the waterlogged conditions of the tomb, a lucky accident that saved them from decay. For scholars, it was like finding a complete manual for running a province, written by the people who actually did the work. Half a world away, the Persepolis Fortification Archive tells a similar story. In the 1930s, archaeologists excavating the ruins of the Achaemenid capital in modern Iran uncovered a vast collection of clay tablets. Thousands of them baked in a fire that had destroyed the palace but paradoxically preserved the tablets. They were inscribed in Elamite, a language once common in the region but long dead. The tablets were administrative records from the reign of Darius himself. They listed rations of grain and wine paid to workers. They recorded travel permits for officials moving along the royal road. They tallied the movement of livestock and the distribution of tools. Each tablet is a tiny snapshot of the empire in motion. Taken together, they reveal a bureaucracy that was obsessed with accountability. Every transaction, every payment, every transfer of goods was written down, often with multiple witnesses. The archive is still being translated today, and every new reading adds another piece to the picture of how the Persians managed their enormous territory. On the northern edge of the Roman world, another set of documents emerged from the mud. The Vindolanda tablets, discovered in a Roman fort near Hadrian's Wall in northern England, were written on thin wooden leaves. They date from around 100 years after the Common Era, a time when the Roman army was stationed in this soggy, remote frontier. The waterlogged soil preserved the wood and the ink remarkably well. The tablets are not official state documents. They are the everyday correspondence of soldiers and their families. One tablet is a birthday party invitation. Another is a request for more beer, but many are bureaucratic: supply lists, personnel rosters, reports on the condition of horses, requests for reinforcements. They show that even on the edge of the world, the Roman administrative machine was running. A centurion could write to his commander with a request, and the request would be filed, tracked, and answered. The Vindolanda tablets make the Roman bureaucracy feel personal, human. They remind us that behind every grand census and every standardized road, there were real people writing real words, trying to make the system work. And then there are the quipus. Most were destroyed by the Spanish, but a few hundred survived, hidden in graves or stored in museum collections. For centuries, they were treated as curiosities, decorations rather than records. But recent research has changed that. Using high-resolution photography and statistical analysis, scholars have begun to crack the code. They have identified that the knots represent numbers in a decimal system. They have found that the colors of the strings correspond to categories: red for military, yellow for gold, white for silver, green for agriculture. Some quipus even seem to contain narrative information, perhaps the names of villages or the titles of officials. The work is slow because there is no Rosetta Stone for quipus, but each new insight reveals just how sophisticated the Inca administrative system was. A quipu found in a coastal village might record the same type of information as one found in the highlands, showing that the empire standardized its record-keeping across vast distances, even without a written language. These discoveries are not just about filling in historical blanks. They are about changing the way we think about ancient states. The kin slips show a legal system that was far more detailed than the legends suggested. The Persepolis tablets reveal a bureaucracy that was not just extractive but managerial, carefully tracking resources to prevent waste. The Vindolanda letters humanize the Roman imperial machine. The quipus prove that a civilization without writing could still build a functional data system. Each find forces historians to revise their assumptions. And every time a new text is translated or a new quipu is analyzed, the picture gets richer. The silence is slowly being filled, but the gaps remain enormous. What other archives lie buried? What other administrative systems have left no trace? The detective work continues, and the story is far from over. The same systems that held ancient empires together still run our world today. The technologies have changed, but the fundamental principles remain so deeply embedded in modern governance that we rarely notice them. Every time you receive a letter in the mail, you are using a descendant of the Persian Angarium. Every time you pay a tax based on your income, you are participating in a practice that the Romans perfected under Augustus. And every time a government hires a civil servant based on a written exam, it is building directly on the foundation laid by the Han Dynasty 2,000 years ago. The civil service examination system, that revolutionary idea that a person's ability, not their birth, should determine their role in government, is perhaps the most direct inheritance from ancient China. The Han Dynasty did not invent the concept of meritocracy entirely on its own, but it was the first to institutionalize it on a massive scale. When the British Empire began to reform its own civil service in the mid-19th century, administrators looked to China for inspiration. They studied the examination system, adapted its principles, and created a model that soon spread across Europe and North America. Today, nearly every modern state hires its bureaucrats through some form of competitive testing. Whether it is the civil service exam in India, the concours in France, or the standardized tests used for government positions in the United States, the ghost of the Han Dynasty is there, sitting quietly in the testing room. Standardized currency and measures are another legacy that we take for granted. When you hand over a $5 bill in New York and it is accepted in San Francisco, you are benefiting from a uniformity that ancient rulers like Qin Shi Huang and Darius the Great fought to achieve. Before them, every region had its own coins, its own weights, its own lengths. Trade was a negotiation, not a transaction. It was slow, uncertain, and ripe for fraud. The modern world solved that problem by creating national currencies, international standards for measurement, and global agreements on what a meter, a kilogram, a second actually means. The metric system, now used by nearly every country on Earth, is the direct descendant of those ancient efforts to impose order on chaos. The same goes for the census. Every 10 years, the United States counts its population, a ritual that began with the Constitution but whose roots stretch back to Roman and Han census takers. The data collected from a modern census determines how many seats a state gets in Congress, how federal funds are distributed, and how resources are allocated. It is the same principle that Augustus used to know how much grain Rome needed to feed its people. Without that regular count, governments would be flying blind. Taxation would be guesswork, planning would be impossible. The census is the foundation of modern public administration, just as it was the foundation of ancient imperial bureaucracy. Legal codes are perhaps the most invisible inheritance of all. When a judge in a courtroom today consults a statute book, she is performing an act that a Babylonian judge would have recognized. The idea that law should be written down, organized, and accessible to all citizens is a direct legacy of the Code of Hammurabi, the 12 Tables, and the Corpus Juris Civilis. Modern legal systems, whether based on common law or civil law, are built on the principle that the law must be predictable, that it must exist independently of the ruler's mood, and that it must be applied consistently. That principle was carved into stone and preserved through centuries of collapse and renewal. It is the reason we can trust that a contract signed today will be enforced tomorrow. And then there is the postal system. When you drop a letter into a mailbox, you are tapping into a network that the Persians built, that the Romans expanded, that the Chinese refined, and that the Inca ran with nothing but human legs and knotted cords. The modern postal service is a direct descendant of the Angarium and the Cursus Publicus. It uses airplanes and trucks instead of horses and runners, but the core idea is exactly the same. A network of relay stations, a system of permits and tracking, a commitment to moving information as fast as possible. The Universal Postal Union, founded in 1874, coordinates international mail across borders. It is a global bureaucracy built on the ancient insight that speed of communication is the skeleton of power. All of these systems, the civil service exams, the standardized currency, the census, the legal code, the postal network, are so woven into the fabric of modern life that we forget they were once revolutionary experiments. They were inventions as brilliant and as fragile as the wheel or the plow. They were created by ancient administrators who faced the same problems we face today: how to manage large groups of people, how to ensure fairness, how to prevent corruption, how to keep information flowing. They solved those problems with the tools they had: clay, papyrus, knotted string, bronze tablets. And those solutions proved so effective that they were copied, adapted, and passed down through the centuries until they became the default settings of modern governance. The hidden bureaucracies of the past are not really hidden. They are sitting in plain sight inside every government building, every post office, every tax form, every standardized test. We just stopped noticing them because they became routine, but they are no less remarkable for being ordinary, and recognizing their ancient origins does not diminish their power. It reveals the profound continuity of human ingenuity, a thread that stretches from the counting houses of Uruk to the data centers of the 21st century. The empires are gone, but their bureaucracies, transformed and refined, are still here, quietly holding our world together. Look closely at these ancient systems and a clear pattern emerges. Despite vast differences in geography, language, and culture, every stable early empire relied on the same set of invisible tools: hierarchy, record-keeping, training, communication, and standardization. They are the 5 pillars that, when working together, turned a collection of conquered territories into a single, resilient entity. Each empire emphasized different pillars based on its circumstances, but none could survive without all 5 functioning in some form. The Han dynasty built its stability on hierarchy and training. The civil service examination created a class of officials who shared a common intellectual foundation. They moved through a carefully graded ladder of positions, each step preparing them for the next. This hierarchy was not just a chain of command, it was a school for governance. A county magistrate had already passed exams, served as a clerk, and managed a smaller district before he ever took charge of a large region. By the time he sat in judgment, he had seen the system from the bottom. That experience made him predictable and reliable. Rome, by contrast, relied more heavily on record-keeping and communication. The census, the tax rolls, the legions of scribes who copied and filed documents, these created a paper trail that allowed the central government to know what was happening in every province. The cursus publicus carried that information faster than any army could march. When a governor in Syria sent a report to Rome, he knew it would arrive and be filed. That reliability made the empire governable. The Persians mastered delegation and intelligence. The satrap system gave local governors real authority, but the king's eyes and ears, combined with the separation of military and civil power, ensured that no satrap could become too powerful. The royal road and the angarium turned information into a weapon that the central government could wield before a rebellion could gather strength. The Inca, lacking writing, compensated with an extraordinary system of record-keeping and communication. The Quipus captured data that other empires would have written down. The Chasquis moved that data faster than any horse. The decimal hierarchy turned the entire population into a living ledger. All 5 pillars were there, but the Inca leaned hardest on the ones that did not require ink. What united all these empires was not a single invention. It was the way these elements reinforced each other. Hierarchy created clear lines of authority, which made decision-making predictable. Record-keeping created a memory that outlasted any individual official, which made corruption harder to hide. Training created a shared culture that made officials interchangeable. which kept the system running when a governor died or a region was reassigned. Communication created speed, which allowed the center to respond to crises before they exploded. Standardization created trust because a merchant in one province knew that the weights and measures in the next province were the same. Each pillar depended on the others. Without hierarchy, standardization had no one to enforce it. Without record-keeping, training had no curriculum to pass on. Without communication, hierarchy could not issue orders in time. The empires that lasted longest were those that kept all 5 pillars standing, even when one began to crack. This synthesis explains why some empires survived for centuries while others collapsed in decades. An empire that relied only on military force, like the short-lived conquests of Alexander, could not sustain itself because it had no permanent administrative backbone. An empire that relied only on terror, like the later Assyrian state, bred so much resentment that rebellion was constant. But an empire that built its 5 pillars patiently, layer by layer, could absorb shocks. It could survive a bad emperor, a lost battle, a famine, or a plague. The machinery kept running because it was designed to function independently of any single person. That is the lesson the Han, the Persians, the Romans, and the Inca all learned. Stability is not a gift, it is a structure, and that structure, hidden beneath the stories of kings and conquests, is the real reason why some empires earned the title of eternal. Quiet machinery of governance proved more permanent than any throne. The emperors, the kings, the pharaohs, their names echo through school books and documentaries, but the systems they commanded have outlived them all. The Han dynasty collapsed nearly 2,000 years ago, yet the civil service examination shaped Chinese governance until the early 20th century and inspired modern meritocracy worldwide. The Roman Empire fell in the West, but its legal codes, its census practices, and its administrative divisions survived in the Byzantine East and later in the legal systems of Europe. The Inca Empire was conquered, but the quipu remained in use in remote villages for generations, and the principles of decimal organization and relay communication still underlie how we structure large-scale projects today. This is the great irony of history. The loudest stories are about conquest and glory, but the deepest influence comes from the quiet labor of scribes, tax collectors, and inspectors. The people who tied the knots, filled the tablets, and audited the accounts are almost never named. Yet the structures they built outlasted the generals who burned cities and the kings who built palaces. The hidden bureaucracies we have explored were not just tools of control. They were the very skeleton of civilization itself. They allowed human societies to scale beyond the village, beyond the tribe, beyond anything that had come before. They transformed chaos into order, and they did it so quietly that most people living inside them never stopped to wonder how it all worked. And that is precisely why they deserve our attention. Understanding these systems does not just teach us about the past, it helps us see the present. The government forms we fill out, the exams we take, the roads we travel, the currency we spend, all of these are echoes of ancient solutions to ancient problems. The empires are dust, but the bureaucracies evolved and adapted and are still here, holding our world together. So now I want to hear from you. Which of these innovations impressed you the most? Was it the quipu of the Inca, a data system without writing, the relay runners of Persia, moving messages across a continent in days? The examination system of the Han, which opened the door of government to talent, or the census of Augustus, which turned an empire into a data-driven state? Leave your answer in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this journey into the hidden foundations of power, please like the video and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories history forgot to tell. The next time you pay a tax, take a test, or drop a letter in the mail, remember the forgotten architects who built the invisible machinery of the world we live in.